One.
Hello, welcome back. We are in lesson 2 of our video and notes in our civil rights unit. Today we are focused on these 2 court cases you see on the screen, Plessy versus Ferguson and Brown versus Board of Education. So we're going to jump on in our topics that we're going to cover today. We'll do a little review of what Jim Crow means, what does it look like, a little refresher from our last video. Then we'll talk more about the Supreme Court, and we'll pay extra attention to these 2 very important court cases that I mentioned in the beginning. And we'll finish up, I'll teach you a little bit of Latin, and we'll talk about what this word status quo means. So this is super important, right? We see that segregation in education has actually created these gaps in the quality of people's education that we still see today. So, right, we can look around, we can see that some schools have state-of-the-art facilities, kind of like Manor. This is a brand new, beautiful building. But there are other schools that don't even have adequate textbooks or, enough chairs or supplies for their students. So we're still seeing this impact us, even though it's over 50 years ago. All right, so a refresher. Last time you tuned in, we talked about Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws are laws that allowed segregation to exist in the South. So, for example, a poll tax, a fee to vote, a payment required before you voted is an example of a Jim Crow law. Also, that literacy test. Remember last class we took a literacy test, that Louisiana literacy test, that was super racist and really frustrating. You had 10 minutes to answer 30 questions of very confusing riddles, none of which having to do with voting or civics, nothing that really measures literacy in any way. And that was a barrier for people to access the voting booth. So literacy tests, definitely an example of laws that allowed segregation to continue. And finally, of course, separating public spaces, for example, having restrooms for white people only and restrooms for everybody else is also an example. So one more time, to segregate is to separate. So segregation is separation of the races, which we see up through the 50s, and we'll be talking more about that today. Okay, so something new. Definition of the Supreme Court is on the screen. So when we're talking about the Supreme Court, we are talking about the highest and most powerful court in the United States. Basically, whatever the Supreme Court says goes. All the other states have to listen to the laws created by the Supreme Court. So we're going to look at 2 Supreme Court decisions that were made about civil rights that are super important to know about. And so here's our timeline, and I'm going to ask you to draw this on your notes because it's important to know which one comes first. So on the left, we're going to start with Plessy versus Ferguson. So this is back 1896, quite a long time ago. This is going to be the court case that made it totally legal to segregate based on race. Then we'll fast forward about 60 years, and we'll look at the court case that made segregation illegal in education. And that was Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. So we're going to look at both of these cases today. So we'll start with the one that comes first. Plessy versus Ferguson is the court case that said it was totally legal to segregate based on race. And so the context of this case and how it came to be was this man, kind of shown here. His name is Plessy, Homer Plessy. He challenged the rules. He was on a train, and there was a car for Black people and there was a car for white people. Now, Homer Plessy was only 1/8 Black. He was mostly white, but he did have a grandparent who was Black. And so he went to go sit in the white-only cart, arguing that he was majority white. And he got kicked out of the cart. He was told that he had to go sit in the Black-only cart of this train. And so Homer Plessy challenges this. He brings his case all the way to the Supreme Court. and says that segregation was unfair. And unfortunately, the court disagreed. Our court said that segregation was legal as long as equal facilities were given to both races. As long as each cart had the same stuff in it, right? As long as the black cart also had seats, right? That the whites only cart had. As long as, say, pretend if this is at the time of air conditioning, right? As long as both carts have facilities like air conditioning and they're both safe, then that was okay in the court's eyes. And so our effect of this is that segregation was made legal. And it was totally okay to separate people based on race. And luckily, 60 years later, we have a change of direction. There is a historic court case called Brown versus Board of Education, and it challenges segregation in the school setting. So it says, here, let me back up. This woman here, this is Linda Brown. Court cases are usually written alphabetically, so her name is in the court case. But Linda Brown and other students, just like her, their reality was, they're young, they're in elementary school, and her parents want to, send their kids to public school, and they've got two options. So right down the street is a school, but it is white only, and across town there is another school open to African American children. And so Linda Brown's family tries to enroll her in the school right down the street, in the white only school. And they are laughed out of the building, right? They're kicked out. They're told not to come back. And so they challenge this. They challenge that segregation is unfair, and that it's unfair for them to have to send their kid across town, take buses to get her there when there is a perfectly adequate school right down the street. And luckily, the school agrees. You can see here, holding the newspaper, High Court, the Supreme Court bans segregation in public schools. They side with Linda Brown. So this group, the NAACP, which is a key civil rights group, they argued the case in front of the court, led by a man named Thurgood Marshall, who I'll show a slide about him in another video. But they were able to win that case. This is a quote from Brown versus Board of Education that's often shared because it summarizes this really well. The court says, "We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. So separate educational facilities are inherently unequal." So here's the court saying, hey, never mind about Plessy versus Ferguson. We're going to scratch that. That was not true. Because if we are separating people based on race, that is inherently unequal. That is not fair. And we shouldn't do that any longer. So I'm going to end with this. So today we talked a little bit more about Jim Crow. We talked about those two key Supreme Court cases and what ultimately resulted in no longer having segregated schools. But we're going to come back to this theme now and again because there's this ongoing theme in civil rights about whether to change or to keep the status quo. That's your little bit of Latin for the day. So in civil rights, there's two directions to take. We can either change as a society, we can desegregate, we can try to be more equal, or we can keep the status quo, keep the same way we've been doing stuff that benefits white people only. And of course, we're going to see as the movement continues how much we are able to change in this period. And of course, we can see how much change we still need to go. So that is it for video number 2, guys. Finish that up. Let me know when you're done. I'll give you a sticker.